Good morning. Welcome to the Southern Poverty Law Center's roundtable discussion, America's HBCUs under the threat of attack. My name is Ara Bedell, and I'm SPLC's Director of Earned Media. Our moderator today will be SPLC's Chief of Staff and Culture, Alicia Brooks. We have the honor of being joined by some of our nation's top brass in education, from the U.S. Department of Education, as well as from select historically Black colleges and universities throughout our United States, all here to weigh in on last week's bomb threats. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded. We've enabled closed captioning. If it doesn't appear, please alert us via the Q&A feature below. All attendees have been muted. The chat is turned off for attendees. However, we will use the chat to share a few helpful links and information with you along the way. Please type your questions at any time during the session in the Q&A feature as well. When submitting your questions, we ask that you list your name and organization and indicate who the question is for. We will answer as many questions as possible. And after the roundtable, we will send a video recording of the session as well as a written transcript, along with relevant links and resources to those who RSVP'd. The video and transcript are available to use in your stories for the outlets you represent or share with your social media network and partners. We don't anticipate any technical difficulties, but if you experience any challenges, our speakers may temporarily go off camera to avoid any program disruption. Please email us at press@splcenter.org if you have additional questions, would like to know more about SPLC's work, or if you would like to interview any of our panelists. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our SPLC Chief of Staff, Alicia Brooks, and today's moderator. Alicia Brooks previously served as SPLC's Outreach Director and was the Director of SPLC's Civil Rights Memorial Center, an experience designed to provide visitors with a deeper understanding of the civil rights movement. Alicia, please kick us off.
Thank you, Araba, and a very, very special thank you to each of you for joining us today for this most important discussion. During our time together today, we will discuss how recent bomb threats have impacted historically Black colleges and universities, the students, faculty, staff, families, and communities. We'll hear about any developments involving law enforcement and government response to these threats. We'll also weigh in on what connection these threats may have with the violent neo-Nazi group, Atomwaffen Division, and share insights and resources and action steps that HBCUs and their broader communities will continue to take in wake of this national threat. Last week, nearly 20 of our nation's HBCUs received bomb threats over the course of 2 days. And just hours ago, we heard about bomb threats against Spelman. A threat that traumatized hundreds of thousands of students, faculty, staff, their families, and surrounding communities. And they were not alone. Black people across the nation are endeavoring to cope with still more acts of anti-Black racism. The SPLC believes this was a racist attack that aimed to not only disrupt the start of Black History Month, but the perpetrators, we believe, wanted to send a message that even learning while Black is not safe from hate. They clearly underestimated the strength of our treasured centers of learning, whose very existence is rooted in resilience. Let's reflect back on last week's bomb threats by viewing a video of news clips.
A rude awakening this morning here at Xavier University, one of a number of HBCUs receiving bomb threats over the last 24 hours.
We received a bomb threat early this morning, circa 3 a.m. Before that, and were notified. The FBI and the NOPD and others responded. We're trusting the federal agencies and also our local and law enforcement are paying great attention to this.
Several other HBCUs received bomb threats this morning. That includes Howard University in Washington, D.C., as well as Morgan State University in Baltimore. They are two of at least 13 others.
Students and staff here at Edward Waters University woke up to that very scary news this morning.
There were multiple explosive devices that had been placed throughout our campus. The plan was to then come onto the campus and shoot any survivors.
I think it's a representation of like where America still stands. Like we're still kind of divided.
Certainly alarming. However, I take great strength from hearing from the HBCU leaders, students, faculty alike. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by a few of our great HBCU leaders. Dr. A. Zachary Faison Jr., President of Edward Waters University. Dr. Walter M. Kimbrough, President of Dillard University. Dr. Ann McCall, Senior Vice President and Provost at Xavier University. Dr. Felicia Nav, President of Alcorn State University, We are also honored to be joined by Dr. Michelle Asha Cooper, the U.S. Department of Education's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Higher Education Programs and the Acting Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education. Dr. Cooper.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you Southern Poverty Law Center for bringing us all together to participate in this roundtable this afternoon. I am delighted to be joined by these presidents, Dr. Faison, Dr. Kimbrough, Dr. McCall, Dr. Nav. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, your campus leadership, for being unwavering in a time of uncertainty and discomfort. Thank you for your courage and your fortitude, in addition to just making sure that your institutions remain places of academic excellence and student success. Let me begin by saying that these acts of intimidation and threats of violence will not be tolerated and have absolutely no place in our institutions of learning. Please know that the threats are being taken very seriously by Secretary Cardona, our U.S. Department of Education Secretary, and the leadership at the U.S. Department of Education. We will continue to work with other federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the FBI, who are leading and prioritizing these investigations. And we will work closely with HBCU leaders as we move forward together to support all efforts to keep our schools and our communities safe. While the interruption to learning is unacceptable, what is worse is that these acts were meant to intimidate and to invoke fear. The timing of these threats to coincide with the first day of Black History Month was a likely attempt to exploit tensions among some factions of our society. The threats that we witnessed last week and throughout the month of January, and even we're now hearing that there's some other threats that are occurring even right now. These threats are reminiscent of the Civil Rights era. Bomb threats against Black people is an unfortunate part of America's history. Today's leaders in the Black and HBCU communities, like the leaders of the 1950s and 1960s, have a persevering spirit. We know that they will not be deterred or distracted. But even though we continue to persevere, let me be clear, these acts of intimidation and threats of violence have absolutely no place in our society and will not be tolerated. In January, right after the first instances of these threats, our Education Secretary, Secretary Cardona, and Secretary Mayorkas from the Department of Homeland Security hosted a briefing with presidents of historically Black colleges and universities from across the nation to share information on grant programs, training resources, and other tools available to HBCUs to strengthen campus safety and security. The FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces are leading the investigation into these nationwide bomb threats, and these investigations are being given the highest of priority. The White House Initiative on HBCUs is also coordinating a government-wide approach. They convened a campus safety and resiliency cluster led by the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. The initiative has posted on its website resources and tools provided by the cluster that are related to safety and security. Several leaders from our agency, including Secretary Cardona, have already met with several HBCU presidents who have been directly affected by these threats. And we know how important it is to keep the lines of communication open between the federal government and our institutional leaders, and we intend to stay in contact until the investigations are complete. We also heard how crucial mental health support is right now for the entire campus community. This pandemic continues to be a challenge for many, and the recent spate of threats further compromises emotional health and well-being. So we plan to work with HBCUs on this topic too. We condemn these threats, and we will do our part to support these institutions and their leadership. We recognize that there is tension in our larger society that spills over and plays out on our college campuses, whether it's school shootings, bomb threats, or other forms of threats and intimidation. They have no place in our educational institutions. In this moment, we are asking that all higher education leaders to be the bridge that will unite instead of the bridge that will divide. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to listening and learning from the presidents who are about to speak. And I want to make sure that you all know that our doors are open for you at the Department of Education, and you should feel free to reach out to me, Secretary Cardona, or as well as our Undersecretary, James Kowal, at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. We certainly appreciate your strong commitment, the Department of Education's commitment, and please thank the Secretary for us as well. I heard you say that you're committed and that this will not stand, and I know that we certainly appreciate that. I'd like to invite any of our panelists, the HBCU presidents or leadership, who would like to ask a question or follow up with Dr. Cooper. Any thoughts at all on the White House's response? Okay. Oh,
I'll jump in just really quick. I think that there has been good communication working with the different presidents and the institutions affected. And then there's been some coordination with the umbrella organizations, UNCF and Thurgood Marshall College Fund. They've really been sending out information. I know they've been in contact with the member institutions as well as with the staff at the White House and Department of Homeland Security and the FBI and Secretary Cardona's office as well. So I think that's been really good. We've gotten good information, just received a message this morning about additional conversations that are being held, work with members of Congress to offer statements of support from members of Congress. So I think that relationship has been good in this time. We need to continue that and look for other ways to deepen that relationship. But I think that there has been active communication, and we want to make sure we continue that.
absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Kimbrough. Provost?
I simply wanted to say thank you. We're very encouraged by the support that we've received, and in particular for the recognition that this is terrorism, right? These are acts of terrorism. The fact that they haven't yet led to an explosion, thank God, does not change the fact that these are acts of terrorism. And so we appreciate that it's being recognized as such, and that our talented, motivated, ambitious students are being supported in their journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Faison, I'm coming to you next.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
We'll just echo the sentiments of my colleagues in the sense that we certainly have been blessed to have had the support, certainly of Secretary Cardona, our U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI and Office of Homeland Security. They actually were on our campus earlier this week, meeting with some of our senior leadership with regard to how we can be proactive, going forward and have access to resources going forward that would, help to certainly protect our students, faculty, and staff here on our campus in Jacksonville. So thank you so very much, Dr. Cooper, and please send Edward Waters' regards to Secretary Cardona. Let him know we appreciate his support.
Thank you. I'm coming to you with the next question. Early reports reveal that 6 juveniles were involved in these bomb threats, and it's been reported that one of them has a purported connection to the Atomwaffen Division. This is a very violent neo-Nazi group that the Southern Poverty Law Center has been tracking for nearly half a decade. AWD is particularly dangerous as its followers tend to trend younger, and they share somewhat of an apocalyptic ideology and fetishize violence. Dr. Faison, when you heard the juveniles were involved, what ran through your mind? Any concerns that public sentiment would soften because of their ages?
Yeah, I'll share with you kind of the first thing that ran through my mind kind of reflexively is this whole notion of, and not to throw a red herring here, but the whole notion of what we're seeing politically in terms of critical race theory and the denial in many respects across the country of history. And so when I thought about young people, I'm thinking about people that don't really understand or appreciate the historicity as it pertains to African Americans in this country, particularly historically Black colleges and universities. And so, as ironic as it might seem, the fact that we are having that discussion around how we should teach our young people, or what we should teach our young people, and the connection and proximity to that with the fact that this heinous act is being committed by reported young persons was particularly alarming for me, and I'm sure for many of us, because this is rooted in many respects out of ignorance, and ignorance not necessarily in a pejorative sense, but in the literal sense that our young people are not being exposed to the history and not being exposed to truth when it comes to these matters of race. So those were some of my initial thoughts. I certainly am hopeful that we won't see a softening of whatever kind of response that there might be if in fact these 6 youths are found to have been guilty of this heinous crime. Certainly, we think this is very serious, and we don't need to see a softening of any kind of response, given the level of the threat and what we know is still a continuing threat, even still till today. So those were some of my initial thoughts.
I so appreciate that, Dr. Faison, and I think you're right on point with that, with respect to the pushback against teaching in a true history. I would also point out that especially in this time of extreme polarization, political polarization, and the increased kind of tendency to exercise violence or engage in violence rather in response to any grievance. And we are seeing this more and more from our elected officials at the highest level. And those responses from our elected officials having an impact on young people that now folks would have us not mitigate through the teaching of correct history or true history. So thank you for raising that point. I invite any of our panelists to address this point further, if you like.
This is Dr. Nave from Alcorn State University. I wholeheartedly agree with my colleagues' sentiments. I would say upon reflection, my first emotion was saddened that we continue as a country, as a nation, to manipulate children. If we look historically back in time during the civil rights era, the pictures of hangings and different things and children were there. So if part of the process requires changing hearts and minds, it starts at a very early age, yet we're still in a space where we continue to mislead our youth, who are ultimately our future. I would hope that the public sentiment does not soften, but I would also hope that those children are provided with the necessary resources and mental health treatment that's needed to begin to help change and cultivate a more positive place of being, place of development and understanding. They're in a very critical point in time in their life and development. Their frontal lobes are not fully developed. We are living in a time that's just filled with extremes. And what we don't want is for it to start to replicate itself, and we see other children in taking up the same mantle, or a counter movement toward that. So, I'm saddened for those kids, but I'm extremely saddened for our students who continue to be traumatized in what is truly some unprecedented times.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts, Dr. Nave. Let me ask you this. We certainly know that acts of hate are nothing new to HBCUs. These schools are rooted in resilience. The students certainly share a common struggle and experience. Dr. Nave, can you tell us how your students and staff are faring after these bomb threats, and how did your surrounding community come together to support you all?
Great question. I am very thankful for the community support that we receive from our state, local, regional, governmental and law enforcement partners, and in coming at the drop of a dime to make sure that our campus was safe. The federal outreach and support, our colleagues from all around the country, but also my fellow presidents in the state of Mississippi, how we called and checked on each other and have come together collectively at the suggestion of President Briggs, who's on the call with me, to put forth a joint statement that we will not be deterred in delivering the quality of education for that upward mobility for our students and those who've been marginalized and left out of the educational process. We've gone around, we've met our students where they were. We've gone to the cafeteria and sat down to have conversations to truly try to get a sense of how this is impacting them. Had great dialogue around the unfortunateness of these individuals and how they've used bomb threats to try to threaten and deter the resources that we've had to use, the continual disruption. We talked about their impact on their mental health, but then we also talked about some solutions, what they were doing around voting rights. If they were registered to vote, if they knew where their voting polls were, if they were encouraging people in their community, that they're educated so that when legislation comes up like critical race theory, they're out there, they're being that next generation of civil rights leaders that our community is going to need. They are disappointed. They are traumatized, but as you said, they're resilient and they are resolved to continue to move forward and to make it known that we won't be threatened, we won't be scared away, that we will continue to contribute to society in a greater sense. And, I'm so very proud of them, and I'm very proud to be a part of such a great community that stepped up and we've supported each other.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nave. That really makes my heart feel good. I'm so glad you're in communication and receiving support and giving support to Dr. Briggs. Unfortunately, Dr. Briggs wasn't able to be with us today from Mississippi Valley State University, but we appreciate your supporting one another. Any comments on what Dr. Nave has offered before I move on to the next question for you, Dr. McCall?
Well, maybe I can follow up just a little bit on what Dr. Nave has said. I think we have to recognize the power of the statement that's being made with the threats. So many of our students choose to come to HBCUs so that they can be at the center, so that they can count fully, so that they can be together and form a community of ambition and accomplishment together. In some ways, a refuge of sorts, where you gain more strength to go out and fight everything that needs to be fought for in this country. And so to attack HBCUs, to claim to want to bomb HBCUs says very much, very strongly, you're not safe anywhere. We don't want you to be able to learn anywhere. We don't want you to be at the center. And so it is disorienting to students to be threatened in their center. But as everybody agrees, you know, HBCUs represent acts of resistance, and those acts of resistance are not one time, they're over time. And so they continue, and we continue to guide them.
Thank you for that. And to that point, just wondering, have other universities, not historically Black colleges and universities, come together in any show of support for HBCUs? I'm reminded of what happened during the civil rights movement when colleges across the country came together in support of attacks against Black community, including HBCUs. So have you heard any of that?
I know a number of the predominantly white institutions that are here in Jacksonville, their leaders certainly reached out to us here at Edward Waters. I've gotten notes from some of our national organizations, NICU, the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, have reached out to us. The CIC, the College of Independent Colleges, has reached out to us. So we really are seeing a cross-section of support in the sector for HBCUs and offering any support that they might offer. I'll also mention, I certainly don't want this conversation or us to leave this conversation underscoring, I think, the range of emotions that our students have had. I think sometimes when you're a victim of this kind of threat, you kind of go through the gamut of emotions. You may start with fear, sadness, anger, but on our campus, our students now are emboldened, believe it or not. They now, I think, have a even more resolve around their identity as students at an HBCU and just what that means. And so I think it really there's a saying that we say in a religious setting like Edward Waters, that what the devil meant for good now is being turned into our favor. And so we're seeing again just a retrenchment from our students wanting and longing to know more of the history, not only of Edward Waters, but of HBCUs on the whole. And they're really being encouraged and emboldened by what our institution stands for, and the fact that they're not going to be intimidated, they're not going to be scared, that they did make a intentional decision to attend an HBCU. And again, they feel encouraged and they are moving forward. And I think they're even more determined to continue their programs of study and continue to produce well and represent their institutions well beyond and post this heinous act.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That really speaks to the real gift of what I think the HBCUs are, that you build students up, that they have a resilience. It doesn't come from anywhere, I mean, you intentionally do that through rigorous study, through teaching and the reteaching of our history, that prepares them to do that and pivot so quickly. I'm also grateful to you and a couple of the other panelists who have mentioned mental health issues, because that is very real. And we don't want to lose sight of that. It's not simply a physical security threat, but it's another mental health challenge that is placed on Black people. And in this case, a large number of young Black people. So coming back to you, Dr. McCall, thank you for your patience. It's been a week, a little over a week. Have the authorities filed any charges with respect to the bomb threats that you experienced at Xavier?
No, they're in a very active and advanced investigation phase. And of course, our first bomb threat this year was on January 4th. So it so happens that we had FBI agents in conversation with us more generally between the two bomb threats, conversations that we were eager to have to help us really set our sights on everything that we need to do to make our campus as safe as possible. So we don't know anything more than what's in the media. And we understand that investigations need also to be quiet in certain details to be effective. We all know from the press that there of closing in on charges on several people. My question would be the networks behind them, the networks above and around them. These are, these individuals need to be prosecuted, and it needs not to stop there, but to look at what's feeding all of this.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate that law enforcement does need time to investigate these things. I would just encourage them to move forward. In light of what you just said about the first bomb threat being January 3rd, one would hope that there would be more news to share with you. And I just believe that you should not be dependent upon news sources to inform your understanding of what's happening with respect to any investigation. So let me go to you, Dr. Kimbrough. Now, while Dillard has not received any bomb threats to date, your university is certainly no stranger to racist threats. And you've spoken publicly about bomb threats and such at historically Black colleges and universities. My question to you is, where do HBCUs go from here? What would you like to see come from all of this?
So I think it's been summed up pretty good. So I'm going to lean in a little bit on what President Faison said about leaning into who we are as institutions. I think that this has been a wake-up call for us. You've heard civil rights leaders talk about this in the past, that we tried to make civil rights a finite period of time. And now that we have some new challenges, we're sort of trying to figure out, like, wait, what do we do with this? And we're asking different kinds of conversations and not really studying the history and leaning into that. I mean, when we think about Birmingham in 1963 and how children were used specifically and put in harm's way. So you had children, 75 put in jail cells meant to hold 8 adults. You had the fire hoses turned on them that created lacerations and tore the clothes off their bodies. And you had the dogs. So, I mean, there are lots of quotes about, freedom is sacrifice. And, I think we've gotten away from some of that, so that when we hear there is a threat, we're just like, oh, what do? We need to have safety and security. When if we understand civil rights, sometimes part of leaning into who we are is actively leaning into that situation, not showing fear, but confronting it directly. So I think there has to be a mindset change for us, that we model that behavior to say, like President Faison said with his students, we need to do that with all of our students, and not, because I think people worry, well, how can we make sure everybody is safe? We have to make a sacrifice sometimes, and we have to show that we are not afraid. Based on the calls that we've had, there have been no credible devices found or anything like that. So a lot of this is the idea is to disrupt us. And it doesn't say that there couldn't be a tangible threat at some point down the road, but we can't just stop doing everything, because that becomes an easy thing for people to replicate over and over again, to say, we're just going to keep doing these bomb threats because we know it shuts down everything. Then you created some additional problems. So I think this is an opportunity to lean into our history. We like to celebrate John Lewis and Bloody Sunday. John Lewis was 21 years old and got his head busted in. So, I mean, that's sort of where we were. So there are some sacrifices that we have to make now. We've got to come together as a broader community and learn from that. But we're going to have to show a level of courage and support and be together in this moment. So I think it wakes us up that, as I heard civil rights leaders say, don't think civil rights is only 1960s. It's different now. And yeah, we have some of these tangible threats, but as President Nave talked about as well, there are some things happening legislatively that we aren't talking about that creates the environment for these other things to happen, because I know I'm not going to be punished if the right people are in place to, say that this activity is legitimate political discourse, if you will. Okay. So those are the kinds of things that I see this as an opportunity for us to really lean into Black History Month. Let's lean into the history and deal with those issues, and then say, how do we learn from that and apply it in this new context?
That's wonderful. And that's so encouraging. I thank you for that. And thank you, Dr. Faison, as well. I think that again, is the beauty of HBCUs, that you're able to do that, able to go back even further and tell the stories of Black folks resilience and standing up against hate and white supremacy, over the centuries. So thank you so much for that. I just want to make the point that the Southern Poverty Law Center is just appreciative to HBCUs, and we know that you're rooted in strength and resilience. And we know that this act will not, or any other act of domestic terrorism, will not in any way completely disrupt or deter HBCU students from their rigorous learning, from the sanctity of the institutions, or their success. I'd like to invite the panelists, if you would, like to share one more point before we go to questions from those that have joined us from the media and elsewhere. Anyone?
I'd like to just quickly offer, I think President Kimbrough makes a very salient point, but even beyond that, as we talk about what support for HBCU looks like, in terms of not just this particular threat, but what I hearken to is, part of the information that we've received is that you have these juveniles that are in, or that were able to levy these threats through some kind of sophisticated work in technology, whether it's, and so, what immediately came to mind for me is how can the Department of Homeland Security, how can the FBI, how can Dr. Cooper, our education secretary, continue to provide resources to HBCUs, for example, in cybersecurity. We need more African-American representation in these spaces. And so I think that, as we talk about support for HBCUs, I don't want to limit that to just this threat. I'd like to see us take this opportunity, as we're seeing that this particular sector of HBCUs that are particularly being threatened, and what does that support look like in terms of helping us to support the young people that might go into some of these law enforcement agencies to be able to protect everyone in our country, but certainly their alma maters and institutions like HBCUs. So I just want to underscore that support is more than just lip service. And it shouldn't be support just when we receive a threat, but how can we catalyze this moment to help bring more resources to historically Black colleges and universities.
Excellent point. As you may know, the Southern Poverty Law Center monitors and tracks hate and extremism across the country, since the 80s. And it's not just this particular group of persons of interest who happen to be young people who are using technology to advance hate and extremism. It's a pattern. And what we've learned through our research is that young people who, well, not just young people, but people on the far right who dabble in extremism are the first or early adopters of new technology, and spend quite a bit of time trying to fly under the radar and go undetected. So your point is well taken, that we need to build the capacity for our HBCUs and communities of color writ large to fight back, to kind of have the tools and the skills to play in that arena to lessen our threat. So thank you for that point. Any others? Okay, go ahead.
If I may add one thing, it's also to contextualize relative to the whole landscape of extremism, which the SPLC follows, of course. We know that we were targeted as a cluster, right? Because we're historically Black institutions. We also know that our neighbors, Jewish neighbors, Muslim neighbors around the country are targeted by white supremacists as well. And so in this teaching that needs to occur around our country, in our country, on topics that are becoming taboo, right? When we actually have extraordinary scholarship out, and it's important for people to read, we need to see that this is part of a large white supremacist project that must not be mistaken for anything other than that.
Thank you for raising that point. It's so true. And it speaks to us working together to push back against white supremacy in that way, to dismantle it, disrupt it, however and wherever it shows up.
And I'd
Dr.
just like to quickly add, I concur with everything my colleagues have said, but in particular, one comment Provost McCall made with regards that these children were the front face, that there's a very complex network that's behind these individuals, and attention that doesn't need to get lost in the conversation, focusing on those students and bringing justice, of course, but making sure that we're also paying attention to the networks that are behind them. I think the conversation needs to broaden. HBCUs are only one subgroup of our broader institutions in the communities of color. How are we carrying this conversation throughout the communities of color to make sure that we're equipping all of our citizens, equipping our kids, their parents, our churches with the resources and the information? And then I think we got to get a lot smarter. They've changed their approach. They're very strategic and intentional. And we need to do the same thing. We need to modernize how we approach it and make sure that we don't just rely on what we've always done, on some of the maybe iterative advancements we made, but we're a smart group of people. We got to think a lot more strategically and really tackle these forms of hate in a more sophisticated kind of way.
Thank you, Dr. Nave. And I believe and hope that we're doing that today, extending this conversation to an audience that moves beyond HBCUs to recognize, just as you say, and as the provost said, the threat is larger than what's being carried out presently against HBCUs. So again, thank you for being with us. I have a question for Dr. Cooper from a WJTV News. What are future measures that will be taken by the U.S. Department to prevent acts like this from happening in the future?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that question. And I want to begin by following up on some of the comments that Dr. Faison just made. I do believe that we need to be looking at support writ large. And one of the things that I'm very proud that this administration has done is that we have certainly been demonstrating that by unprecedented levels of support for our institutions that are important to our society and that are important to our workforce, but that have been historically and woefully underfunded for decades. And that certainly does include HBCUs, but it includes tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, community colleges as well. And so we're really proud to say that we are going to continue that level of support because we want to strengthen these institutions so that they can continue to serve their students and serve our broader society. In terms of things related to these specific threats, we will continue to partner very closely with the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. They have been taking the lead on many of these investigations. And so that will continue to be where we emphasize our partnership with them. They are certainly looking at things like policing and security. They are looking at ways to provide institutions with some trainings and some additional resources. We talked to several college presidents on a call that Secretary Cardona had with Secretary Mayorkas, where they talked about the need for updating emergency plans to not just deal with natural disasters, but also these types of physical threats. So we would be happy to continue working in partnership with that. And we are looking at the issue of mental health. We recognize that that has been an important reality of many of our communities since this pandemic, especially. I think many of these issues were already present in communities, and the pandemic just made it worse for many more people, and it also put a national spotlight on it. So we will continue to work with various agencies like the Department of Health and Human Services, like the HBCU associations like NAFIO, Thurgood Marshall College Fund, and UNCF, as well as individual campus presidents, to make sure that they have the resources that they need to support their students at this particular moment in time.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. This question is for Provost McCall and Dr. Kimbrough. This comes from Sabrina Wilson at Fox News 8 in New Orleans. Are you concerned about the ongoing threat? Are you concerned that the ongoing threats will negatively impact recruiting or boost it? while students may feel emboldened by the threats, parents could have concerns. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect that it would. I mean, we, in this area, we deal with a lot of challenges, hurricanes particularly. So we're just a resilient people here, and sometimes people get tired of saying that as well. But I mean, it's the world that we're in right now. I think some of this will subside after a while once there are some arrests and people see that they're going to be held accountable to that. But I've been really trying to find historically, has there been an actual bomb that has gone off at any college or university? It's not something that is really hard to find. So once again, the goal of a lot of these things are to disrupt everything. And that could be part of disruption. And if people say, well, I'm not going to these schools because they're having bomb threats, then they win. I mean, that's the easiest way that I can put it in terms of, and then what stops that person next from saying, okay, now I'm gonna start doing bomb threats at Black elementary and middle and high schools, because then that could happen too. And those are softer targets than any of our campuses. So we've got to think about it, rationally, that, for this period of time until there are some high profile arrests and people realize, all right, that's enough of that. I think we're going to have to weather that storm like we do so many storms. I don't think about it as much as that there won't be people who come because of that. Because once again, if we shut down everything because that happens, that sends a bad message to a lot of folks, and they're going to go after all kinds of institutions. And they've done this in the past too. They've done bomb threats. My dad was a pastor in Atlanta that had churches with 7,000 members, and we talked about it. He was like, we got bomb threats at Cascade. The difference was that was in the 90s, and you couldn't find out about it. It's easy now to do the bomb threat and get all this publicity, right. So people are leaning into that. So we can't cave to those kinds of things, because if we do, they win. And so we've got to be resilient and understand that it could be us now. And people say, well, I'm afraid to send my child there. Well, when they change their ire and start looking at other Black institutions, you can't run from everything. So that would be my message, that you can't run from everything.
Thank you, Dr. Kimbrough. Provost McCall, would you like to add to that?
Certainly can't say anything better than President Kimbrough has there. I would just add to it that our nation, certain groups of people in our nation have not needed to face all of this. And I think it is a wake-up call to everybody about strength, resolve, commitment to the values that we claim to have, right? And so in the same way that our students, I believe that we will do fine in our recruitment. We have a strong enrollment plan, we have strong response. We know that the students whom we attract are dedicated to, attainment, careers in great professions, and to serving their communities. And I don't believe that this will dissuade them. I think, though, that this is an opportunity for everybody in the country to have a reality check about what it means to belong to and be part of communities that are oppressed, have been oppressed, and that are doing so much to further themselves. I mean, HBCUs have been around, going to Xavier's almost 100 years old. We have some that are closing in on 200 years old, of existence, right? And to think of what that means in terms of a country that desperately needs to live up to its ideals.
Thank you, Provost McCall. The next question is coming to us from Lauren Lumpkin at the Washington Post. First, she thanks you for being here today. The panelists have talked about the mental and emotional stress caused by the threats, but what about financial? Can you discuss or even quantify the way these threats have strained financial resources at your universities? Dr. Faizan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I think in the immediate, the answer to that question is that we don't know quite yet. I think, for us, we did set down operations for the day. And so, of course, we were not operational for that almost about 18-hour period or so. But I think I'm optimistic and kind of share some of the sentiments that Dr. Kimbrough and Provost McCall shared. We don't believe in our case that we're going to see any kind of diminution in terms of enrollment or interest in our university. Here in Jacksonville, our enrollment has remained strong. Again, just call me, Mr. Optimism, but I think that the response that you've seen from HBCUs and the HBCU community, I think is going to embolden our growth even the more. I don't think that students and parents are going to be afraid. I think the political climate is one where, as Dr. Kimbrough mentioned, you know, if it's not, it may be us today, it may be another institution tomorrow. It may not be for race, maybe it's because of political persuasion at a particular institution. But I think that our responses are what's going to be indicative in terms of parents and students making their prospective choices for what universities that they choose to attend based upon our values, based upon intrinsically who we are, what we stand for, and again, kind of how we collectively and even individually respond to these kinds of things, I think will reveal the tremendous value that exists at HBCUs. And again, I'm hopeful and encouraged that students and parents will double down and say, I absolutely want my son or daughter to attend an HBCU because of the response that we're seeing from these institutions that have been impacted by this.
Thank you. Dr. Nave, would you like to add?
I would agree. I think we're still assessing what that's going to be as we look at our emergency response. I do think in our after action review that we're going to see opportunities where we can be secure our campus in different ways to be more dynamic and responsive to different types of threats that the university face. And so I think that's something that is yet to be determined. We did not shut down operations. We went to virtual operations. It's something, I'd say one of those nice things we picked up from COVID, knowing how to pivot and keep it moving. And, you know, the local state resources that have come in, of course, to assist us in checking all our buildings and different things. There was no cost associated with that, but the time that it took out of the day and things that we would have been doing but could not because of the attention to this. But I think a lot of the cost is going to come down the road, and that's yet to be determined.
Thank you both. I so appreciate your kind of positive outlook on it, because it proves, as Dr. Kimbrough was raising earlier, that the domestic terrorists have not won. You're not deterred. You're still focused on the students and providing them with the education and the community and support that they have come to rely on. So thank you for that. Last question, it comes to us from Chile Whitfield at the Griot. Many believe that if other prestigious universities like Harvard or Yale were receiving bomb threats, that there would be a larger and quicker response with arrests and preventing more threats. What can you all say about this? Do you think that justice will be served when it's too late and people are hurt due to these bomb threats? Also, have we seen reports that these 6 juveniles are involved? Have we received confirmation? I think she's asking, has it been confirmed by authorities? That's an open question for anyone who would like to respond.
I guess I'll jump in real quick. So these things travel in cycles, because I was trying to look at the history of some of this. Last November, there was a bomb threat at Yale. And then 2 days after that, Brown, Columbia, and Cornell had bomb threats as well. So this isn't new to a range of institutions in higher education. It's not just HBCUs. So there have been some, and I don't think we've heard anything about any high profile arrests with those institutions. So I don't know. I think sometimes we look for there to be a lesser response. As I think we've said, and we haven't received one directly, but talking to my colleagues and the information I get from UNCF, the federal government has been extremely responsive to us, probably even more so than the Ivy League institutions that have their own resources. So I think they realize that, we need some assistance in this regard. But, several months ago, this is 3 months ago, you have bomb threats at Ivy League institutions as well. So this becomes complicated because we're dealing with white supremacy, as I call them, the Kitty Klan, and all of that in this CRT environment. That's why this is elevated, but it does happen other places as well. So I think we just have to keep that in mind. I don't think there is a different response. And I think that people are probably even a little bit more responsive to us because of the overall climate in the country that is concerning, and not just for HBCUs, but for people of color in general. When you look at the hate that's being, the attacks on Asian Americans, I mean, it's a lot of stuff going on. So I think that that's a part of it. So I look at it like that, and as I think my colleagues that have experienced this directly, there has been, good response. If we haven't, had it, you would have heard it by now. We're not ashamed to say we need a better job. So I think we need to give credit to the federal government and local and state officials who've really jumped in. But once again, you go back and look in November, Ivy League institutions did get bomb threats. It didn't get this kind of coverage because we're in a different climate.
Thanks so much for that response. I'm going to jump to another question. I know I said that was the last, but we just got in a question from an HBCU student. So I want to put this to you all. What are your universities doing to implement safety measures? What should students do to advocate for ourselves to feel safe? And we close with a quick response from each of you.
So at Alcorn, as I mentioned, we're sitting down with all of the players at the table to revisit our emergency management plan. We've made contact with our local agent who will have Homeland Security to come out to do some additional training and education amongst the senior leadership staff. But I think the response on each campus is going to be different because you have to contextualize for where you are. Alcorn is a rural community, and how we're situated is quite different than our sister school, Jackson State, which sits in the heart of the city. There are measures that we can take with cameras, with security, with checkpoints and different things. And then just making sure that we educate all of our constituents, our faculty, staff, and students to be more vigilant. In our chat and chew with our students, one of the things I left them with was, if you see something, say something. If you see something that looks off, someone that doesn't look like they belong in the community, let someone know. Don't wait. Don't brush it off, because that's going to be our first indication and our best opportunity to nip something at the bud. And so I think the responses are going to be varied, but we do have to all sit down and just take a look at what happened and what are some of the best ways that we can shore up our various communities and campuses.
Thank you, Dr. Nave. If there's anything additional, I invite you. We're just down to the last couple of minutes.
I'll just say that we're doing much of the same, reassessing, our emergency management protocols on our campus. And I was pleased. It was a good moment, or at least some silver lining as a president, to see that our emergency management protocols really went into place with our technology, text messaging, robocalls to all of our students, our faculty and staff, everyone sheltering in place. I think it was an opportunity for us to see how those protocols played out. Certainly, we're deepening, I think, our relationships with our local law enforcement here, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, Office of Homeland Security, offering us resources. We sit in an urban environment here in downtown Jacksonville. And so one of the things that was maybe fortuitous, it wasn't as a response to this, but we don't have a contiguous campus in many respects, because we sit literally in the heart of the African-American neighborhood here in Jacksonville. So we're actually undergoing right now a multi-million-dollar project that's going to be able to bring about some quantifiable barriers kind of to our campus to keep the ingress and egress in terms of folks coming on and off of our campus. So that's one of the things that we have currently that we had just actually broke ground on about 2 or 3 weeks prior to this threat, that we're looking to help to fortify the safety and security of our students and community here on our campus.
Thank you, Dr. Faison. I'm going to close here, and I just want to close with appreciation to each of you. You're doing incredible work, and I just couldn't be more proud and grateful. I want you to know that the SPLC stands in support of you, your efforts, the HBCUs, the communities that you serve. If there's anything that we can do, please call upon us to do so. And as we noted, hate and extremism is a problem and an issue amongst our young people. You all have raised some interesting ideas as to how to address that. I think it's important that we listen to those and be mindful and do what we can and push back against all efforts to prevent us from teaching truth and helping young people. It underscores the need for parents to be attuned to signs of radicalization to help inoculate their children against being drawn into these extremists, down this extremist path. You may or may not know the SPLC is working in partnership with American University in their Polarization and Extremism Research Innovation Lab, PERIL, and working to bring awareness and provide resources to confront and overcome the radicalization of today's youth. So please, we'll drop it in the chat. Please pay attention to that link. Know that we're with you, as I mentioned, and so appreciative of you. Thanking the U.S. Department of Education for joining us today, Alcorn State University, Dillard, Edward Walters, and Xavier. Thank you all for lifting up some important messages for us to think about and pointing out ways that we can support you all and move beyond this current threat from a white supremacist faction. So thank you so much. I turn it over back to you, Araba.
Thank you, Alicia. So for those who were not able to have their questions answered either via the chat or live, please email us at splcenter.org. We again thank you all for joining us. We appreciate the universities who let us borrow the leaders for an hour, as well as the U.S. Department of Education. And we do these sessions quite regularly, so please join us again. We thank you for helping us keep this story on top of mind until it is resolved. Thank you, and you all have a wonderful day.